We all have ideas. Whether those ideas determine the next meal we eat, thing we wear, or place we go, ideas are plentiful when navigating through life. Sometimes an idea is prepped and ready to be thought up. Other times, an idea takes hours, days, weeks, months, maybe even years to fully develop. In the case of the latter, an idea may often be in regards to some wholly new venture you have undertaken. Perhaps you've decided you want to be a novelist, and upon trying to think up your first story, you realise that ideas do not simply come to you because you're consciously trying to think them up. If pursued long enough, however, an idea will eventually form. This may come to you in the most unexpected of times. For me, ideas rarely come consciously. I can think of many times where a seemingly meaningless interaction, sight, act, whatever, sparks a thought that somehow manifests the final piece to the puzzle that is now, undeniably, my idea. Eureka. We all love a eureka moment, but having had many myself, and understanding where it leads to next, I think it is fair to say that the cerebral inception of the idea, as satisfying as it is at the time, can often be the beginning of a curse of high expectations. This is because with ideas come responsibility. The idea is now yours to get wrong, and this is only exacerbated by time. In the interim between the inception of the idea and you trying to actualize it, an idea can grow to such proportions that the mere thought of trying to turn it into a tangible thing can stop you in your tracks. And this has been the story of my life. Many times have I procrastinated on tackling what I believe to be a great idea, simply due to the cold reality that in order to do so I need to face my limitations as a creative. What is in my head will never be truly translated to the page. I've been struggling with that reality a lot recently. I can't seem to get the ball rolling on anything, and the longer I leave it, the more I convince myself that the next video has to be better than ever. Sometimes I have to take inspiration from what is preventing it, and right now it is a mild form of perfectionism, a mindset I thought I had outgrown a few years back when I first started the channel. When working on my first video in 2021, I felt compelled to make my first upload the most perfectly researched, edited and written video essay that ever essayed, so as to start this channel with a bang. Upon realising a few weeks later that this was not going to be the case, I nobly done what any egotistical 20-something-year-old would do when presented with the reality of his incompetence. I branded myself as a perfectionist. This initial self-masturbatory self-diagnosis was rooted in self-preservation. It felt comfortable to tell myself that nothing was getting done because I was working towards the absolute ideal quality. In other words, it allowed me to procrastinate. But this was only for some time, for when I began researching perfectionism, what it was, who brought it to light, and the underlying mental illnesses associated with it, I found a much less romantic answer to why I was struggling to pull together these ideas, alongside some useful ways to embrace imperfection and alleviate the self-inflicted unnecessary pressure I was putting on the creative process. My first exploration of perfectionism in 2021 pulled me out of a rut and got the ball rolling on this channel. Today I am hoping to do the same. I may be branding myself a perfectionist once again, but this time I do so with no ego or self-preservation, because now I know what it truly means. I am scared to fail. Perfectionism is a personality trait wherein an individual will set exceedingly high standards for themselves and attach their self-worth to the attainment of near unattainable goals, usually to the detriment of their mental health. I say usually because this negative definition only applies to one of two types of perfectionists. These two types are known as adaptive and maladaptive perfectionism. The former is a more realistic and positive form of perfectionism wherein an individual will expect a high standard in their chosen pursuit while simultaneously remaining happy in the sheer act of attempting to reach that standard. The latter, however, is a more negative form of perfectionism in which an individual will expect near to impossibly high standards that are destined to fail. When the inevitable happens, the individual will be further reinforced in their self-perceived inferiority, and to compensate, will continue setting these expectations of perfection to rectify that perception. In short, a maladaptive perfectionist will attach their self-worth to the attainment of an impossibly high standard, whereas an adaptive perfectionist will attach their self-worth to the process of trying to reach that standard. Unsurprisingly, perfectionism has been linked with varying mental health disorders like anxiety, depression, and obsessive-compulsive disorder, to name a few. Perfectionism was first brought to the public consciousness in the 1950s by two psychoanalytic theorists, Alfred Adler and Karen Horney. Independent of one another, these two had commented on the negative effects underlying the neurotic pursuit of perfection. Horney had done so in a 1950 book, Neurosis and Human Growth, the struggle towards self-realization. In the third chapter of the book, She referred to perfectionism as the tyranny of the should, and saw the need for perfection as a wholly negative symptom of a neurotic mind. The neurotic sets to work to mould himself into a supreme being of his own making. He holds before his soul his image of perfection and unconsciously tells himself, forget about the disgraceful creature you actually are, this is how you should be. And to be this idealized self is all that matters. You should be able to endure everything, to understand everything, to like everybody, to always be productive, to mention only a few of these inner dictates. Since they are inexorable, I call them the tyranny of the should. The idealized self Horney refers to in this chapter continually undermines the real self. Whilst the idealized self is a man or woman who can do no wrong, is fit, intelligent, has a great job, an amazing family, is beautiful, is everyone's friend, and can solve all and any problem whether his or her own or someone else's, the real self is likely half of that man or woman, probably even less than that. The point being that a neurotic will cast shoulds in all directions and aspects of his or her own life. These shoulds are often unrealistic and are too demanding of anyone, no matter how well put together they are. Horney gives a brief run through of a few shoulds that the neurotic will hold themselves to. He should be the utmost of honesty, generosity, considerateness, justice, dignity, courage, unselfishness. He should be the perfect lover, husband, teacher. He should be able to endure everything, should like everybody, should love his parents, his wife, his country, or he should not be attached to anything or anybody. Nothing should matter to him. He should never feel hurt, and he should always be serene and unruffled. He should always enjoy life, or he should be above pleasure and enjoyment. He should be spontaneous. He should always control his feelings. He should know, understand, and foresee everything. He should be able to solve every problem of his own, or of others, in no time. He should be able to overcome every difficulty of his as soon as he sees it. He should never be tired or fall ill. He should always be able to find a job. He should be able to do things in 1 hour which can only be done in 2 to 3 hours. These shoulds can point both ways. Whilst we may presume the shoulds to solely refer to either the present or future, they can also be thrown back into the past, most notably towards childhood. Horney describes the differing extremities to which a neurotic mind will go when retrospectively examining their childhood and its impact on them as a person. Horney claims that in order to view how a neurotic views the past, we must look at what the neurotic wants at present. For example, if a neurotic wants to be, as Horney says, all sweetness and light, then a neurotic will spread a golden haze over his childhood. Horney also points out that a neurotic who takes no responsibility for their life will lump all the blame on their parents. On the other extremity, a neurotic may hold an unrealistic amount of the responsibility for the way they were affected by their childhood. Consequently, the shoulds are cast back at a negatively affecting childhood to which the neurotic had little to no control over. The shoulds are then attached to the neurotic's response, how he or she should have had the strength to endure the childhood, or how he or she should have come out of the childhood unscathed. The fact that the childhood did affect the neurotic, however, is only a sign of his or her imperfection. In viewing the childhood as such, the neurotic will fail to grow past it. Horney's chapter on the tyranny of the shoulds still holds true to those who find themselves overcompensating in the perfectionist department. I found this chapter to be a reassuring read personally, and advise anyone else who falls into the perfectionist trap to do so too. I always find myself desperately trying to spin too many plates. The job, the social life, relationships, working out, reading, eating clean, offering the perfect advice, keeping up this channel, yet in the end, all I do is break the plates. I believe the overcompensating of perfection is a coping mechanism for deflecting failure, and I mean real failure. Instead of putting your heart and soul into one venture, whether that be creative, physical, career-driven or social, it is easy to spread yourself so thin that the expectation is failure. When failure eventually comes, you can pride yourself on having taken on a mammoth of a task that was likely to fail anyway. This overcompensating is merely fear, an inability to come face to face with your weaknesses. The shape you're in, the intelligence you have, the discipline you hold, the way people view you. In doing so many things at once, these natural weaknesses will surface. But instead of them being further evidence of those weaknesses, they are simply the slip-ups of a brilliant person who is doing so much he is bound to fail every so often. You are then free to resume spinning. In my opinion, the healthy shoulds should fall to one or two aspects. It is good to be hard on yourself sometimes, but by setting yourself unrealistic standards, you set yourself up for a comfortable failure. You've already accepted failure before you've even began, subconsciously anyway. Therefore, you should focus solely on one thing with the intensity you did all those other shoulds. And if you still fail, at least you have the clarity behind those failures and thus the means to overcome them, to outgrow them. Coming back to Hornai, like I said, the chapter is helpful in identifying the ridiculousness of these expectations we place on ourselves. Simultaneously, it is soothing to know that you're not alone in these needs for perfection. However, where Hornai fell short was in a one-dimensional view of perfectionism, which was nothing to her but negative. Alfred Adler, on the other hand, saw perfectionism in a multi-dimensional way, as he viewed it as having both pros and cons. Adler did believe that the need for perfection developed from a childhood inferiority. However, he also understood that to work towards perfection is a natural part of being human. In a 1956 article, he said, "The striving for perfection is innate in the sense that it is a part of life, a striving, an urge, a something without which life would be unthinkable." Adler's outlook got the ball rolling on what would later grow into a multi-dimensional way of perceiving perfectionism, and over the years these two dominating types have been characterized in many different ways: adaptive and maladaptive, positive and negative, active and passive, normal and neurotic, positive striving and maladaptive evaluation concerns, and the most recent, personal standards perfectionism and evaluative concerns perfectionism. Normal and neurotic perfectionism would be the first titles these two differing types would be given when D.E. Hammerschek published an article called Psychodynamics of Normal and Neurotic Perfectionism in 1978. 2 years later, the first self-report measure of perfectionism was published. The creator of this scale was David Burns. 3 years following this, another scale was published, this time made by David Garner. Both scales, however, were focused on the wholly negative perception of perfectionism established by Karen Hornai. It wouldn't be long though until a new scale was born in the early 1990s. This scale was developed by two Canadian researchers called Gordon Flett and Paul Hewitt, who called it the multidimensional perfectionism scale. This scale contained 3 dimensions: self-orientated, the internal desire for perfection, and the belief that to be perfect is important; other-orientated, putting unrealistically high standards on other people; and socially prescribed, the belief that others expect them to be perfect. Hornai talks about these differing types in her chapter, 40 years before the scale was made. The first dimension, self-orientated, is the general basis of the chapter. However, the next two, other-orientated and socially prescribed, she touches on towards the end. On the former, she says, "A person may primarily impose his standards upon others and make relentless demands as to their perfection. The more he feels himself to be the measure of all things, the more he insists, not upon general perfection, but upon his particular norms being measured up to. The failure of others to do so arouses his contempt or anger." And on the latter, she says, if he believes in this way that others are expecting or demanding things of him, he may, again, respond in 2 different ways. He may try to anticipate or guess at their expectations and be eager to live up to them. In that case, he usually also anticipates that they would condemn him or drop him at a moment's notice if he fails. Or if he is hypersensitive to coercion, he feels that they are imposing upon him, meddling in his affairs, pushing him or coercing him. He then minds it bitterly, or even openly rebels against them. The history of perfectionism is a long winding road of theories and research. It is a complicated psychological phenomenon as it is connected to multiple mental illnesses and could be born out of multiple factors. Couple this with the fact that striving for perfection is not necessarily something that should be cut off altogether. If we could go back in time and wave a wand of anti-perfectionism over the many notable names of history, then we would be living in a far less developed world right now. Additionally, striving to perfect something, whether that be a craft, a way of life, or a mentality, brings challenges that will undoubtedly make you question yourself, your self-worth, and everything leading up to that inevitable wall we all hit when reaching for a goal. Needless to say, there are a fair few differing opinions, and many debates have taken place. Some psychologists have even argued that there is no healthy perfectionism. It is not my place to say. It would be easier, however, to provide a case study and let you decide for yourself whether the pursuit of perfection was positive or negative. In choosing, I had 2 options. Both options came from 2 small instances relating to perfectionism that have stuck with me for years. At first, I chose a manga artist, but having been deflated by the perfectionist anecdote I had based my case study on potentially being false, I pivoted to the next perfectionist on the list. In 1998, director Stanley Kubrick recorded an acceptance speech for the D.W. Griffith Award whilst midway through filming his last movie, Eyes Wide Shut. After expressing his regret for not being able to receive his award in person, Kubrick tells an anecdote about himself and Steven Spielberg that encapsulates the stresses and anxieties associated with the creative process. One day whilst Kubrick and Spielberg were talking about cinema, Kubrick turned to Spielberg and asked him what the most difficult and challenging thing about directing a film was. Spielberg replied, "Getting out of the car." Kubrick followed Spielberg's quote by saying this, "I'm sure you know the feeling, but at the same time, anyone who has ever been privileged to direct a film also knows that although it can be like trying to write War and Peace in a bumper car in an amusement park, when you finally get it right, there are not many jobs in life that can equal the feeling." The feeling of getting out of the car, or in other words, facing the day's tasks, are, like Kubrick said, a feeling we all know. And that's true. When the burden of responsibility is placed on your future self, the setting of a task can be an exciting thing. You may tell yourself that this weekend you're going to write, or get started learning an instrument, or try make it to the gym a specific number of times. It can be anything. But when the day rolls around and the task you set yourself must be dealt with, it can be difficult taking the first steps towards it. The initial expectations you place on the future task can be intoxicating, but if left too long, can become so high a task that you're destined to get it wrong somehow, and the thought of getting it wrong stops you completely. Like Kubrick said, "I'm sure you know the feeling." Yet despite all of us having these apprehensive starting line moments right before tackling the task at hand, so few would go to the lengths Kubrick did to make sure his vision was as accurately translated to reality as possible. Kubrick was notorious for his perfectionism. If you Google perfectionism and go on Wikipedia, you'll find a picture of him. But what I found interesting was whether this perfectionism was positive or negative. I would have to imagine that the majority who stumble across this video will be familiar with Stanley Kubrick and his films. His first feature film, Fear and Desire, was released in 1952, and his last was in 1999 when Eyes Wide Shut was released merely months following Kubrick's death. In between these two films, Kubrick produced some of the best cinema we have ever seen and cemented himself as one of, if not the, best director of all time. In cementing this legacy, a few legends stuck to Kubrick whilst he was in his prime. He was sensationalized as a reclusive mad genius who had emerged from his hidey hole in England to drop yet another large step forward in cinematic evolution right before returning to conjure up new ideas. Additionally, Kubrick was often praised for his meticulous perfectionism when directing a movie. Kubrick's work ethic and commitment to the actualization of his ideas were praiseworthy due to the final result. If his films were shit, he would simply just be a crazy person. The line between mad and genius is often a slim one. In his early career, Kubrick did not have the creative vice grip on all aspects of his movies that he would obtain in the early 1960s. Following the release of his sixth feature-length film Lolita in 1962, Kubrick's long-term friend and producer James B. Harris had stepped away from producing Kubrick's movies in order to focus on his own career. This split was necessary as the two had been working together for 10 years, and with Kubrick's star slowly rising, he needed to see if he could continue his momentum by taking on both the directing responsibilities and the producing responsibilities. The first film in which he would do so would be his 1964 classic Dr. Strangelove, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. A trend I noticed when looking at Kubrick's catalogue was the increase in time between the release of his films following Dr. Strangelove. Prior to Dr. Strangelove, the longest gap between movies was 1957 to 1960, a 3-year gap. Post Dr. Strangelove, however, the gaps increased quite significantly. From Dr. Strangelove to 2001 A Space Odyssey, it was 4 years. From 2001 to A Clockwork Orange, it was 3. Then A Clockwork Orange to Barry Lyndon, it was 4 again. From Barry Lyndon to The Shining, it was 5. And from The Shining to Full Metal Jacket, it was 7. And from Full Metal Jacket to Eyes Wide Shut, it was 12. The added creative control and increased budgets allowed Kubrick the time to focus even more on his craft, right down from the idea's inception to the film's release. Perhaps some reaching and these gaps are purely coincidental, or maybe down to some uncontrollable factors outside of the filmmaking process. Perhaps so. However, perfectionism begins at an idea's birth, and I would have to assume Kubrick felt the pressure of perfection weigh heavily with every new film he made, causing him to spend extra time on the details of the film way before production. Coming back to Dr. Strangelove, the renewal in circumstance allowed Kubrick to ramp up his obsessive desire for perfection. The first ever biography written about Kubrick was by Vincent Labruto, who published the biography 2 years before Kubrick's death. In the biography, Labruto dedicates a chapter to each film and the process Kubrick went through to make it. The chapter on Dr. Strangelove is called Do You Think This Is Funny? And highlights the lengths Kubrick would go to tackle a subject as accurately to both his creative vision and historical truth as he could, Whilst prepping for Dr. Strangelove, a satirical film about nuclear annihilation, Kubrick threw himself into researching nuclear weaponry. Kubrick studied 46 research books, among them The Effects of Nuclear Weapons, Soviet Military Strategy, Man's Means to His End, The Causes of World War III, and Nuclear Tactics. He devoured the work of leading nuclear strategists Harman Kardon, Thomas Schelling, and Edward Teller, the man known as the father of the bomb. Kubrick's momentum when set on an idea continued on into the production stage. Actor George C. Scott, a man who had shared a set with many notable directors before and after stepping on the production set of Dr. Strangelove, was not prepared for the level of hard work and meticulousness he would witness when working with Kubrick. Stanley is very meticulous and hates everything that he writes or has anything to do with. He's an incredibly, depressingly serious man, with this wild sense of humour, but paranoid. Every morning we would all meet and practically rewrite the day's work. He's a perfectionist, and he's always unhappy with anything that's set. Kubrick's attention to detail was as far as the accuracy of the interior of the B-52, going as far as trying to get the switches inside as accurate to the real life ones as he could. The associate producer of Dr. Strangelove, Victor Linden, later spoke of working with Kubrick in an article for Glamour magazine. Linden spoke about how when telling Kubrick that something either would or wouldn't work, Linden would have to explain exactly why and have ready-made answers to potential follow-up questions. Linden also said that whilst Kubrick delegated non-creative tasks out of pure necessity, he would linger over everyone and ensure all jobs were carried out to his vision and standard. Thus, it is easy to see that Kubrick made the most of the additional creative control granted to him for Dr. Strangelove, and this control would remain his moving forward. There are many anecdotes and legends of Kubrick's intense commitment to perfection. However, the most notorious example of this is in the amount of takes Kubrick would shoot during production. Kubrick holds the Guinness World Record for most retakes for one scene with dialogue. The scene in question is the Shine scene from Kubrick's 1980 film, you guessed it, The Shining. The number of takes was 148. Pull out any post-Dr. Strangelove movie and you can find examples of these numerous takes. The reasonings behind them are varied, however. One of the reasons was simply down to Kubrick not knowing what he wanted. A classic quote of Kubrick's is, "I do not always know what I want, but I do know what I don't want." This quote encapsulates the reasonings behind his methods. In repeatedly retaking scenes, Kubrick was able to try varying elements of a shot until he felt it conveyed the emotion he was going for. Patience is the underrated ingredient of creativity. Therefore, the creative process is so broad and malleable that having so many options can make finding the right one a tedious trial and error. What perfect was something to be discovered. From the angle of the shot, the lighting of the set, the performance of the actor, to the ever-changing lines of the script. The process is constantly being worked and reworked until all components somehow align. Any outsider who viewed this process of creation would give Kubrick the perfectionist label. However, there was one man who vehemently disagreed with this label, and that was Kubrick himself. Many of the mythological anecdotes of Kubrick were often downplayed by Kubrick when interviewed, but one of the most fought against was the idea of him being a perfectionist, and his multiple takes being an example of his perfectionism. Kubrick chalked up his many takes to a simple reason: unprepared actors who did not learn their lines. Kubrick argued that an actor who is not disciplined enough to learn their lines will deliver an unconvincing performance. This is due to them not being able to properly convey the right emotion, because a part of them is focused not on the performance, but on the lines they have to perform. Whether this was true, I do not think it is an explanation for Kubrick not being a perfectionist. Kubrick went to painstaking lengths to get things detailed and accurate way before he even picked up a camera. Additionally, Kubrick would shoot multiple takes on scenes that had no dialogue at all. Take for example a scene in Eyes Wide Shut that took 95 takes to get right. The scene was simply a shot of Tom Cruise walking through a doorway and only lasted 1 minute. As well as this, Eyes Wide Shut, a film that contained actors as notoriously committed and prepared as Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, holds the Guinness World Record for the longest constant film shoot. The production lasted over 15 months with one continuous shoot lasting 46 weeks. Needless to say, Kubrick was a perfectionist. Whether his perfectionism was positive or negative is a lot harder to determine. Personally, I think it all falls down to what angle you come at the question from. If viewed from the perspective of a film lover, I would assume positive. However, if viewed from the perspectives of those he made redo these takes and undergo immense stress in the pursuit of perfection, it could potentially be negative. Tom Cruise developed an ulcer on the set of Eyes Wide Shut due to stress. Shelley Duvall was purposefully emotionally drained on the set of The Shining, and Matthew Modine got into a heated argument with Kubrick after Kubrick fought back against the idea of Modine accompanying his wife to hospital because it would run over the shooting schedule of Full Metal Jacket. Maybe these actors and many more would view it as negative. It is hard to say because the end result was arguably worth it, and now they have cemented themselves in some of the most iconic movies ever made. The juice, therefore, may have been worth the squeeze. At the end of the shooting of Full Metal Jacket, actor Arliss Howard approached Kubrick to say his goodbyes and to thank him for the opportunity. Matthew Modine would later elaborate on this interaction in an interview that may answer the question of whether it was positive or negative for these actors. And he said, "Yeah, well, Stanley, I'll see you later." And Stanley said, "You know, you're going to miss me." And Arliss said, Yeah, I am. I will. I'll miss you." He goes, No, you're going to really miss me. When you're working on set and the director calls, "Cut, we got it, let's move on," and you're going to know that you don't have it and that we shouldn't move on, and you're going to miss me because you know that I would never cut and say let's move on unless I knew we had it, and you're going to miss me. And Arliss said the first time that he went to work on another film and the guy said, "Cut, we got it, let's move on," he said, "I really miss Stanley." The last person I have not considered when wondering whether this perfectionism was positive or negative was Stanley Kubrick himself. To be honest, who knows? Was he driven by a negative low self-worth that he channeled into his films? Was his perfectionism the should of a neurotic mind that constantly beats itself up for not having everything aligned perfectly? Was it simply OCD, anxiety and or depression? Again, who knows? But in coming back to that 1998 statement Kubrick made when accepting the D.W. Griffiths Award, I think we could make an educated guess and say that it likely maybe was positive. Making a movie, as Kubrick said, was like trying to write War and Peace in a bumper car. Yet when done correctly, the job of movie making brought to him a feeling unlike anything else. Judging by the catalogue Kubrick left behind, I would have to assume he was able to enjoy that feeling time and time again. It is not like his perfectionism paralysed him. He may have related to Spielberg's response when Kubrick asked him what the hardest thing about making a movie was, but he never let that response dictate what he did next. It is no surprise that at the age of 70, and having had years of experience behind him, Kubrick felt like this was an important message to convey in the limited amount of time he had for his acceptance speech. After years of media speculation on Kubrick, his reclusiveness, meticulousness, perfectionism and heralded genius, Kubrick took his allotted time to make himself human and point out a human fear we all share: the fear of failure. In fearing failure, however, this speech shows that you can make something of it. If you are passionate enough, you should feel this degree of responsibility towards getting something as close to perfection as you can. The most important thing to remember though is that you will not achieve perfection through inaction. Like Spielberg and of course Kubrick, the pursuit of perfection cannot be achieved easily and sometimes you may want to quit. But regardless of these feelings, you must remember that in trying to get there you will at least get closer than if you hadn't tried in the first place. In other words, you must not stay in the car. You know, the whole thing about perfectionism, the perfectionism is very dangerous. Because of course if your fidelity to perfectionism is too high, you never do anything. Because doing anything results in, it's actually kind of tragic because you sacrifice how gorgeous and perfect it is in your head for what it really is. So how do you overcome perfectionism? From searching for the answers myself back in 2021, I found a few vague suggestions we all could do with hearing, regardless of whether your perfectionism is mild or extreme. The first being, go easy on yourself. It is an easy conclusion to come to, and likely one you could come to yourself, yet nobody likes to do it. In my opinion, being easy on yourself is the first step towards overcoming perfectionist thinking. By perfectionist thinking, I am of course referring to maladaptive perfectionism. If you can go through life as an adaptive perfectionist, then do not allow that gift to go unused. However, if you find yourself procrastinating, never reaching goals because they're unrealistic, or simply feeling underwhelmed by the end product of your pursuits, then being easy on yourself is like an alcoholic admitting they're an alcoholic. It's a small yet vital first step towards recovery. In accepting that you are now going to be easy on yourself, you can start to change the elements that are leaning towards the maladaptive side of perfectionism. When I felt like I was struggling with a maladaptive perfectionism in 2021, I relieved the pressure in a few ways. Just to remind you, at the time I was attempting to create my first upload for this channel, and in doing so was hopelessly beginning videos and discarding them as soon as they didn't live up to my unreasonably high expectations. What I realised when I found myself ruminating on ideas, trying to actualise them, and then discarding them when that idea failed to live up to the expectations I had in my head, was that the only way to get any good at anything is to become comfortable with the imperfections. I got so sick of stressing over all the minute details of content creation, most of which I hadn't even got to yet due to being stuck at the starting line, that I decided to set myself 3 strict rules that made sure I couldn't get too hung up on stupid details. First off, I gave myself a deadline. I decided that I was going to give myself exactly 2 weeks to make a video from the inception of the idea to the uploading of the video itself. In 2 weeks, I would get an idea, research a topic, create a thumbnail, write a script, record the script, edit the video together, and then upload it. No time to think too much. Secondly, I lowered my expectations and the difficulty of the topic. I chose a short story instead of a full novel, and I had a relatively clear concept that wouldn't be too stressful on the brain. Lastly, and most importantly, I stopped trying to get everything right. You'll be surprised at the level of rewiring you can achieve by consciously reminding yourself of simple anxiety-reducing affirmations. Whenever I began to worry about a, in the grand scheme, minor detail, I would just consciously remind myself that it doesn't need to be bulletproof, because what it does need is to be uploaded. On the 24th of June 2021, I uploaded my first video titled Patriotism by Yukio Mishima, Honourable Death. Looking back, it is average. The script is messy, the audio sounds bad, the visuals are basic, and the pacing is painfully slow. But it was uploaded, and that was the win I took from it. In allowing myself the room to fail, I was able to expose myself to the flaws of my content, and exposing myself to these flaws, I was able to improve upon them on the second upload. I found that improving on small imperfections was easier in a new project than in the same one repeatedly. Sometimes you just have to complete it, learn from it, accept its shit, and fix what was broken in the next one. Otherwise, you won't get anything done. It kills procrastination when the pressure of perfection is taken off. None of this is to say, by the way, that reaching for perfection is a bad thing. Of course it isn't. What I am saying is that the relationship is what needs to be adjusted. Don't be maladaptive, be adaptive. To reach perfection, I believe you need to be a realist with a twinge of delusion. Allow that delusion to cloud your mind, to narrow your vision, and spur you on to the completion of your goal. But when things begin to fall apart, fall back on your realistic outlook. Remind yourself that the pursuit of perfection isn't one with a finishing line, and that the end result does not define you in any sort of way. Instead, perfection is a carrot on a stick, and your efforts are simply the ones and twos on the mat of a treadmill. It may not be attainable, but hey, the pursuit of it makes you run a lot faster. And besides, sometimes the beauty of things can be found in the imperfections anyway. There is a Japanese aesthetic concept called wabi-sabi that champions imperfections and rejects the pursuit of perfection. Wabi-sabi has its roots in Zen Buddhism, and the idea cannot be truly translated to the English language. In the 14th century, the two words wabi and sabi developed more positive connotations in comparison to the meanings they had harboured earlier. Wabi became a way to refer to things that are rustic, simple, fresh, and usually made by nature, whereas sabi became a way to refer to the beauty of an object or person that is worn by time. Together, the two words have created an aesthetic that is used to encapsulate the beauty that can be found in the wrinkles of a face, the crack in a pot, the misshapen wooden leg of a chair, or the asymmetry of a bowl. I have adopted this way of thinking in times of imperfection, of which, admittedly, there are many in my life. Anything worth doing is going to bring along its own hurdles. The trick is not to allow that hurdle to be you. Accept hard tasks as hard, and confront your limitations as a creative. If the first time round the creative block does not go to plan, then at least you now know the destination, and next time round can navigate it a little better. There are many differing ways to beat perfectionism, and I can only put forward my personal anecdotal solutions. My perfectionism was a unique kind, as all ours are. We all aspire to different things and want to reach those things in different ways. Sometimes the aspirations are exterior. People expect you to be a certain way you're not or simply can't be at that point in time. Or maybe you just think they expect that from you. Other times it's interior. You expect an unrealistic amount of yourself and crumble in the process, achieving nothing. It is a tightrope of a conversation because the last thing I would want to do is discourage somebody from pushing themselves. Do not take that away from this video. There is a healthy and unhealthy side to everything, and for perfectionism, I'm merely focusing on the latter. Therefore, if you relate to anything presented in this video, I recommend one simple trick. Go easy on yourself. This does not mean give up, or don't dream big, or you're simply not good enough. It is simply a way to ease the already hard path you've set yourself on. Reduce your expectations down to something achievable, hold yourself accountable to those realistic goals, accept the charred edges of your pursuit, and enjoy the process. At the beginning of this section, I used a quote from David Foster Wallace where he talks about the act of working on an idea as sacrificing something gorgeous for what it really is. To me, that is creation. Before the statue is sculpted, it is a pristine block of marble that is yours to fuck up or make into something even better. My pristine block of marble was the beginning of 2024. At the start of 2024, I thought I had plenty of ideas. Monthly book reviews, multiple video topics, personal essays, etc, etc. I'd seen the renewal of the year as a starting line for a new productive me that evidently was never there to begin with. Not to say I couldn't be that person, but the belief that person would magically appear because the end of the date is 2024 instead of 2023 was mental. I set all these expectations for myself and in the process got nothing done. Therefore, this video is an attempt at breaking the cycle of perfectionism. Since my last upload, I have written and discarded multiple scripts. In finding myself falling into this loop, I thought the best way to tackle that perfectionist procrastination was to write about it. Hence this video. However, no matter what I may preach in regards to the unproductive nature of trying to be perfect, I'm still unable to shake it on a daily basis. I was supposed to write this over a month ago, but have since then found a multitude of ways to avoid completing this essay. I have sought out easier pursuits of productive spare time like going to the gym, seeing friends and reading books, all in the name of deluding myself into believing that once they are all done, I will sit down and bang out this very essay. I always get around to it eventually, but when in the mindset of procrastination, I see the future completion of a task as being done by someone completely disconnected from who I am at that point in time. In my mind, the person who will actually get that task done is a far better person than me, more capable, more intelligent, more disciplined, and more determined. All positive characteristics that will be handed to me without elbow grease if I simply wait long enough and fill the interim with distractions. However, once that belief runs out, I tackle the task at hand the same person I always was, just as I am doing now. In all honesty, I am not happy with this essay. I am not even sure if you could call it an essay. On top of this, I have no idea how it will all be turned into a video. Maybe it won't. Once again, the idea in my head has not translated perfectly to the page, but fuck it. It's done now, and with it being done, I can focus on the next one. And hopefully, that next one will be exactly how I've always wanted it to be. Perfect.